Modern medicine has come incredibly far. We've eradicated smallpox, we cured countless of infections with antibiotics, and can even edit genes to treat disease. But despite all this progress, there are still common diseases affecting millions of people that continue to completely baffle scientists. Today, we're looking at 5 diseases that you've probably heard of before, that affect a huge number of people worldwide, and that we still don't fully understand. We know some of what's happening in the body, but the main question of why this disease occurs remains a complete mystery. And as we dive through these 5 diseases, you might start to notice some surprising patterns. So let's dive right in. If you've ever had a migraine, you know it's not just a bad headache. We're talking a debilitating pain, often on one side of your head, that can last for hours or even days. Many people also experience nausea, extreme sensitivity to light and sound, and some even get visual disturbances called auras, like seeing flashes of light or zigzag patterns before your pain hits. And migraines are incredibly common. Around 1 in 7 people worldwide suffer from them, with women being 3 times more likely to experience them than men. That's over 1 billion people dealing with this condition. So what do we know? Well, we've made some real progress understanding what happens in the brain of migraines, or at least in the brain of some migraine. In about a quarter or a third of patients with migraines, especially the ones with aura, it starts with something called cortical spreading depressions. That's a wave of abnormal electrical activity that slowly spreads across the outer layer of your brain, the cortex, kind of like a ripple moving across water. This wave temporarily shuts down normal brain function in its path, which is what causes those visual disturbances. As this wave spreads, it triggers inflammation around blood vessels in the brain and releases a molecule called CGRP, calcitonin gene-related peptide. CGRP is a powerful pain signaling molecule that causes blood vessels to dilate and activates pain nerves around them. This is what creates that throbbing, intense pain. In fact, we've now developed drugs called CGRP inhibitors that can block this molecule, and they work pretty well for some people, which proves we're on the right track. But what's really interesting? The majority of those migraine sufferers don't get these auras. So what's happening in their brains? Well, we don't quite know. Some scientists think that the cortical spreading depression might still be occurring, but then in the deeper brain regions, such that we can't easily detect it. But we don't have solid proof of this. This is one of those areas where our understanding is still incomplete. What we also still don't understand is what activates the trigeminal-vascular system. This is the network involving the trigeminal nerve, a major nerve that provides the sensation and pain to your face and head, and the blood vessels surrounding the brain. When a migraine starts, this nerve gets activated and releases the inflammatory chemicals around the blood vessels, which amplifies the pain. But what flips this switch? What tells the trigeminal nerve to start firing and dump all those inflammatory molecules? That trigger remains mysterious. And third, why are women so much more susceptible than men? We know that hormones will play a role, because many women notice their migraines are linked to their menstrual cycle, and migraine patterns often change during the pregnancy or menopause. Estrogen fluctuations clearly matter, but we don't understand the exact mechanism. How do changing estrogen levels make the brain more prone to those spreading waves of dysfunction? Is it affecting the blood vessels, the nerve excitability, or inflammatory pathways? We're still trying to piece all of these things together. On top of that, we still don't know what the individual triggers are. Why does a red wine set off a migraine in one person, but not in the next? Why does stress, certain foods, lack of sleep, or weather changes? What is it about these triggers that sets off this wave of cortical spreading depression in these susceptible people? There's clearly a genetic component, because migraines run in families, but we haven't pinpointed the exact genes or combination of genes that are responsible. And despite our new CGRP blocking treatments, they don't work for everyone, which tells us we're still missing pieces of the puzzle. Scientists are still actively researching all of these questions, but in the meantime, migraines remain a frustrating mystery for millions. Imagine waking up every day feeling like you've just run a marathon. Except you haven't. You're exhausted, your brain feels foggy, your muscles ache, and the worst part? Resting doesn't even help. In fact, even minor physical or mental activity can make you crash for days or weeks afterwards. This is the reality for people living with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MCFS, also called chronic fatigue syndrome. And it is far more common than most people realize. It affects up to 1% of the general population worldwide, which could be close to 70 million patients, with women being diagnosed about 3 to 4 times more often than men. For decades, this condition was dismissed as psychological or all in your head, but we now know that it is a very real, debilitating physical disease. So what do we know?
Well, we know that ME/CFS often starts after an infection.
Oftentimes this is a viral infection like an Epstein-Barr virus, be triggered by other viruses or even bacterial infections. This has become especially clear since the COVID-19 pandemic, as many long COVID patients develop symptoms that look remarkably similar to ME/CFS.
We also know that people with ME/CFS have something called post-exertional malaise, or PEM. This means that even after small physical activity or mental activity,
like taking a shower, having a conversation, or walking up the stairs, their symptoms dramatically worsen for days or even weeks. This isn't normal fatigue. Something about the exertion triggers a systemic crash in these patients.
Research has shown some concrete abnormalities. People with ME/CFS show dysfunction in their mitochondria,
the powerhouse of the cells that produce the energy. Their cells seem less efficient at generating the energy molecule ATP. We've also seen signs of immune system dysfunction, with persistent low-level inflammation and abnormal immune cell activity, even years after the initial infection is cleared. And there's evidence of problems in the autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that controls the automatic functions like heart rate and blood pressure, which might explain why many patients experience
dizziness, heart palpitations, and problems regulating the body temperature. But here's what still baffles us. We don't know why an infection in one person triggers a signaling cascade that leads to the ME/CFS. What makes it that an individual is susceptible, but another isn't? Is there maybe some genetic predisposition that we don't know of? And crucially, we don't know what the exact mechanism is. Is it that the immune system just never shuts off after that infection, leading to a chronic stage of inflammation?
Or is it autoimmunity, where the immune system starts attacking the body's own tissues? Or is there some kind of persistent viral reservoir hiding in tissues that we can't detect with the standard tests? We also don't know why mitochondrial function becomes impaired or how to fix it. Is the mitochondrial dysfunction a cause of the disease or a consequence of something else going wrong?
And why does any activity lead to such a severe, prolonged crash? What really happens at the cellular level as a mechanism during that post-exertional malaise? Well, researchers are thinking that it could be due to how cells handle oxidative stress or how they process
lactate during activity, but we're still investigating this. Another mystery, why are women so much more affected than men? Like with migraines, hormones likely do play a role, but the exact mechanism linking sex hormones to ME/CFS susceptibility remains unclear.
And perhaps most frustratingly, we have no reliable diagnosis. We have no blood tests, no scans, no other objective measure that could definitively diagnose ME/CFS. Diagnosis is entirely based on symptoms
and ruling out other conditions, which is part of why patients often wait years to be properly diagnosed and why the condition has been so stigmatized. Scientists are actively researching all these questions, especially in light of the long COVID bringing renewed attention and funding to the post-viral illnesses.
But for now, ME/CFS remains one of the most mysterious and poorly understood conditions in modern medicine.
You've had the blood tests, the stool samples, colonoscopies, CT scans, all the works. And every single test comes back normal. Yet you're dealing with chronic abdominal pain, unpredictable bloating, and bowel movements that swing wildly between constipation and diarrhea. Your gut is clearly not working properly,
and medicine can tell you why. This is irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, and it's remarkably common.
IBS affects about 10 to 15% of the people worldwide, making it one of the most prevalent gastrointestinal disorders. For many people, it's not just uncomfortable, it's life-altering, affecting work, social activities, and general quality of life. But what do we know about IBS? Well, we know that it's something called a functional disorder, meaning there's no visible structural damage to the intestines when we look at scopes or imaging. The gut looks normal, but is not functioning normally. We've identified several abnormalities in IBS patients. Many show something called visceral hypersensitivity. Their gut nerves are essentially overreactive, sending pain signals to the brain in response to normal digestive processes that wouldn't bother most people. It's like the pain volume has been turned way up. We also know there's problems with gut motility, the coordinated muscle contractions that move food through your digestive system. In some IBS patients, the gut moves too fast, causing diarrhea. In others, it moves too slowly, causing constipation. And in many, it's erratic and unpredictable. There's also compelling evidence for gut dysbiosis, imbalance in the trillions of bacteria living in your intestines, collectively called the gut microbiome.
IBS patients normally have different compositions compared to healthy people,
with less diversity and different ratios of beneficial versus potentially harmful bacteria.
Some patients also have low-grade inflammation in the gut lining, even though that's not enough to show up on any standard tests. And here's something fascinating. We know that there's a strong gut to brain connection involved.
The gut has its own nervous system, sometimes called a second brain, with millions of neurons that communicate constantly with your actual brain through the vagus nerve and chemical signals. In IBS, this communication seems disrupted. Stress and anxiety can trigger these IBS symptoms in patients. But at the same time, patients with IBS have a way higher chance of getting a depression or anxiety disorder, meaning that this gut-brain axis is off in both directions. So here's what still baffles us. What does even cause this IBS in the first place? And similarly, why do some people develop this visceral hypersensitivity while others don't? Is there a genetic component? Well, some studies suggest so, but there's no genes clearly identified yet. About 10 to 20% of the IBS cases occurs after a gastrointestinal infection, something called post-infectious IBS. The infection clears, but the symptoms persist. Why? Does the infection permanently alter the gut microbiome? Does it trigger low-grade immune activation that just never shuts off? Or does it damage the enteric nervous system, the network of the nerves inside your gut wall? We don't have answers to any of these. And speaking of the microbiome, we know that this is altered in IBS patients, but we don't know what causes this alteration. Is it really the IBS itself that causes a different composition of those bacteria? Or is that bacterial composition altered first, and does that drive the IBS symptoms? And if these bacteria are involved, which species are actually relevant? What we also still don't understand is the mechanisms behind these different IBS subtypes. Like, why do some patients develop this diarrhea predominant IBS, while others just get the constipation predominant IBS? Is it just the same conditions with slightly different mechanisms, or are they basically completely different diseases entirely? And the most frustrating part is that the treatments are a complete hit or miss. Why do some treatments work for one patient but not the other? I think, like I said before, there's a decent chance that this might just actually be multiple different diseases categorized all as IBS, while they require different approaches to handle. We just don't know how to distinguish them yet. Scientists are actively researching the gut microbiome, the gut-brain axis, and potential biomarkers that would help to distinguish these different IBS subtypes. But for now, IBS remains a complex puzzle for millions. Imagine experiencing excruciating pelvic pain during your period. Pain so severe, it interferes with your daily life. You might also have pain during sex, painful bowel movements or urination, and despite wanting to start a family, you're struggling with infertility. You see multiple doctors over the years, but it takes around 7 to 10 years before anyone can tell you what's wrong. This is endometriosis, and it's far more common than most people realize. It affects 190 million women worldwide, about 1 in 10 women of reproductive age. Normally, endometrium lines the inside of the uterus. Each month, it thickens in preparation for a potential pregnancy, and if pregnancy doesn't occur, it sheds during the menstruation. That's simple enough. But in endometriosis, tissue that behaves like endometrial tissue moves to outside of the uterus. On the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the outer surface of the uterus, the bladder, intestines, and sometimes even further away. And just like tissue inside the uterus, this misplaced tissue responds to your monthly hormonal cycle. It thickens, breaks down, and bleeds. But unlike normal period, the blood has nowhere to go. It gets trapped, causing inflammation, severe pain, scar tissue, and infertility. So what do we know? Well, we know that endometriosis is estrogen dependent, meaning it thrives in the presence of estrogen and often improves during pregnancy or after menopause, when estrogen levels drop. That's why many treatments focus on suppressing estrogen. We also know there's an immune component. In healthy women, the immune system should recognize and clear any endometrial cells that accidentally end up outside the uterus. But in endometriosis patients, this doesn't happen effectively. Their immune systems seem to tolerate these misplaced cells, and there's evidence of chronic inflammation and altered immune cell activity in the pelvic cavity. We've also found that endometriosis can cause nerve growth in areas where it shouldn't exist. The endometrial lesions can stimulate nerves to branch out and become more sensitive, which helps explain the severe, chronic pain that many patients experience. It's not just inflammation. The nerve system itself is being rewired. But here's what still baffles us.
We don't actually know how the tissue gets outside of the uterus. The leading theory for decades has been retrograde menstruation.
The idea that during a period, some menstrual blood flows back through the fallopian tubes into the pelvic cavity, carrying endometrial cells with it.
And this probably happens in many women. But that's exactly the problem. Up to 90% of the women have that backwards menstrual flow, but only 10% of women develop endometriosis. So if most women have that backwards menstrual flow, why do only some develop endometriosis? There are competing theories here. Some researchers think that cells outside of the uterus can turn into endometrial tissue by a process called metaplasia. Others propose that stem cells from the uterus can travel through the bloodstream or the lymphatic system to distant sites. And even in rare cases, men have been reported to have endometriosis. These men were treated with high-dose estrogen, but still that challenges our understanding completely. We don't know which of these theories is correct, or maybe that multiple different mechanisms can play a role in different types of endometriosis.
We also don't understand why symptoms vary so wildly between patients. Some women have minimal endometriosis, but excruciating pain, while others have severe, extensive disease, barely any symptoms.
There is no correlation between the severity of the endometriosis and the amount of pain that a patient has. So what does determine those pain levels?
Is it about where the lesions are located, how deeply they invade, or how they interact with the nerves? We're still figuring all of this out.
Another mystery, why does endometriosis cause infertility in some women, but not in others?
We know it can distort the pelvic anatomy, create scar tissue that blocks the fallopian tubes,
and create an inflammatory environment that's hostile towards embryo implantation. But even women with minimal endometriosis can suffer from infertility. So we don't quite know the mechanism yet.
There's also clearly a genetic component, because endometriosis runs in families, but we haven't pinpointed any specific genes that are responsible.
And frustratingly, we have no non-invasive diagnostic tests. The only way to diagnose endometriosis right now is through laparoscopic surgery,
where a camera is inserted into the abdomen to visualize the lesions. That's a major reason why diagnosis takes so long. Many women have their pain dismissed for years before getting that surgery. Treatment options are limited and often unsatisfying. The hormonal suppression can help manage the symptoms, but it doesn't cure the disease. While the laparoscopic surgery, it can remove the lesions, but the endometriosis will oftentimes come back. So we need a better understanding of the mechanisms to develop better treatment plans for endometriosis patients. Scientists are actively researching the origin of the endometriosis, the role of genetics and epigenetics, and looking for biomarkers that will allow for earlier non-invasive diagnosis. But for now, endometriosis remains a severely understudied disease that profoundly affects millions of women.
Your entire body hurts. Not just one joint or muscle, but everywhere. Your neck, your shoulders, your back, your hips, your arms, your legs. The pain is constant, aching, sometimes burning or stabbing. Even a light touch or a hug can be excruciating.
You're also exhausted. You're struggling with brain fog, and sleep doesn't help.
When you see a doctor, they run all the tests and everything comes back normal. This is fibromyalgia, and it affects an estimated 2 to 4% of the people worldwide. For decades, fibromyalgia
was dismissed as psychosomatic, meaning doctors thought it was all in the patient's head. But now we know it's a very real neurological disease,
involving how the brain and nerve system process pain signals. So what do we know?
The core problem in fibromyalgia is something called central sensitization. This is where the central nerve system, so the brain and spinal cord, become hypersensitive to pain signals.
The volume is turned way up. Stimuli that would normally not cause pain,
like light touch or pressure, get amplified and perceived as painful. It's like the pain processing system has malfunctioned and is sending those false alarms constantly. We found objective evidence for this using brain imaging.
Functional MRI studies show that fibromyalgia patients have heightened activity in pain processing regions of the brain in response to the same stimuli that barely register in healthy people.
Their brains are literally processing normal sensations as painful. We also know there are abnormalities in the neurotransmitters,
chemical messages in the brain. Fibromyalgia patients often have lower levels of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, which are involved in regulating mood and pain perception. They also tend to have elevated levels of substance P, a neurotransmitter that amplifies pain signals. and there's evidence for problems with the body's natural pain-inhibiting systems. These systems normally dampen the pain signals, but in fibromyalgia patients, these systems are underactive. And many fibromyalgia patients also have sleep disturbances, specifically disruption in deep, restorative sleep. Some researchers think that poor sleep might contribute to this pain amplification, creating a vicious cycle. Fibromyalgia often overlaps with different conditions as well. Most of them we've discussed before, such as ME/CFS, IBS, migraines, and chronic headaches, which indicates that some of these diseases might have some underlying mechanisms in common. But here's what still baffles us. We don't know what causes fibromyalgia in the first place, or that central sensitization. Why does the nervous system suddenly start amplifying all those pain signals? We know that some cases start after, for example, physical trauma. Others begin after infection. Just like ME/CFS, we're seeing some long COVID patients develop fibromyalgia-like symptoms, suggesting a post-viral trigger might be involved. But many cases have no clear trigger at all. So what makes certain people susceptible? There's clearly a genetic component to this, because fibromyalgia can run in families. But we haven't found any specific genes yet. Is there some inherited pattern to the central sensitization? Or are multiple genes involved in pain processing, neurotransmitter regulation, and stress response? We also don't understand the mechanism behind the central sensitization at all, at the molecular level. So what's happening in these neurons and the synapses that causes this persistent amplification of pain signals? Is it changes in receptor sensitivity, alterations in how those neurons communicate, or structural changes in pain pathways? We're all still figuring this out. And why do symptoms vary so dramatically between patients, and even within a single person, from day to day? Some people have chronic pain, others have flares and remissions, so what determines this variability? And once again, we don't have any objective diagnostic test. We have no blood markers, we have no imaging findings, there's no test that can definitively diagnose fibromyalgia. Diagnosis is clinical. It's based on widespread pain lasting more than 3 months, tenderness upon examination, and ruling out other conditions. So the lack of a biomarker for diagnosis really contributes to the stigma and the diagnostic delays. Treatment options help manage symptoms, but they don't cure the condition. Medication that modulate neurotransmitters, physical therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy can all help, but they work differently for different people, and we don't know why. Scientists are actively researching the neurological mechanisms, potential biomarkers, genetic factors, and connections to other chronic pain and fatigue syndromes. But for now, fibromyalgia remains a complex puzzle affecting millions. So, what do all of these conditions have in common? Well, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed a pattern. First of all, women are disproportionately affected by every single one of these diseases. Migraines, ME/CFS, IBS, endometriosis, and fibromyalgia all affect women at much higher rates than men. And this isn't a coincidence. Historically, conditions that predominantly affect women have been dramatically underfunded relative to their disease burden. Even more concerning, and in 2020, only 5% of the global research and development funding was allocated to women's health sciences. Think about that. Half the population, but only 5% of the funding. And second, these are all what we call invisible illnesses. So there's no clear blood test that diagnoses them, there's no scans that show pathology, and no biomarkers that can identify them. Diagnosis relies on symptoms, clinical examination, and ruling out other conditions. And this is why patients often wait years to be properly diagnosed, and why these conditions are so stigmatized. And that brings us to our third commonality. For decades, these diseases were dismissed as psychological or all in your head, or simply not real. Primarily women were told they were anxious, depressed, dramatic, and that the pain was normal. Stigma has contributed to the funding disparities, as conditions where a patient is blamed for their ailment are often under-prioritized. For example, endometriosis was long wrongly stereotyped as stemming from life choices. This lack of objective tests make these conditions so incredibly difficult to study. For example, we can't simply develop a mouse model that replicates the full complexity of human fibromyalgia or IBS. We can't simply measure a molecule in the blood and track whether a treatment is working. This makes research slower, more expensive, and harder to fund. But here's the good news. Things are finally changing. The Gates Foundation announced a $2.5 billion commitment through
2030 to accelerate research and development focused exclusively on women's health. The renewed attention brought by long COVID, which shares so many features with ME/CFS and fibromyalgia, has forced the medical community to take post-viral syndrome seriously in a way that they haven't before. Millions of people now understand what it's like to have debilitating symptoms that just don't show up in tests. And that's driving real change. These conditions are real. They're not psychological, they're not imagined, and they deserve the same research attention, funding, and medical respect as any other disease. We are finally starting to get there, but there's still a long ways to go. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you, or someone you know, suffers from any of these conditions, please drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your experiences. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.